Hey APUSH, I'm going to walk you through the Gilded Age in pictures. Get ready, because I got a lot to show you. So we're going to start off with this quote from the great writer Oscar Wilde. A cynic is a man who knows the price of everything, but the value of nothing. Think about what that means and how that relates to the Gilded Age, right? So we've talked about this kind of rise in materialism and the desire for more things after all the sacrifice of the Civil War. And we're going to see that reflected in a lot of these images. Okay, so let's get into it. All right, so here you can see Lower Broadway. Look at New York City in 1875, you guys. If you've ever been to New York City, you can appreciate this, that, it still feels a lot like this. But look at the clash between the old and the new. You still got the horses and buggies, but we're starting to see modern buildings and, this bustling city that we now know as New York. So look at that and think about how we're going to see this just dramatic transformation during the Gilded Age. Okay. Buildings get taller. We've got more steel available. So land is at a premium price. So they figure out pretty quickly that you want to build up and not out. And so this is why with the advancements in the Bessemer process and cheaper steel, more readily accessible steel, of course, we studied how Andrew Carnegie kind of cornered the market on that and was making a ton. And you can see why, because the cities are growing dramatically. So we've got two guys, architects here, really responsible for creating that whole idea of the skyscraper. We've got Louis Sullivan and Daniel Burnham. Daniel Burnham is the one that actually was responsible for planning downtown Cleveland. So this whole idea of city planning and creating a downtown space. And I think we've seen this today, even with the revitalization of downtown and what they've done to Public Square. So just looking at some images here. So Cleveland is a great example. And whenever I have friends visiting from out of town that have never been to Cleveland before, I had a friend come from Oregon, and she was just amazed at our buildings, you guys, like things you walk by all the time when you're going to Indians games or Cavs games, maybe the Browns game. We don't have these buildings in other cities that didn't grow during the Gilded Age. What are we looking at here? I bet some of you have been there. This is the Cleveland Arcade. Kind of this old relic, of the Gilded Age. The 1896 Republican National Convention was there. There's not as many stores there now, but Heinen's is attached to it. The Ritz-Carlton is there, and it's just gorgeous. I mean, they just don't make malls like this. Look at the detail, right? Look at every effort that goes in. It's just this classic Gilded Age architecture here and just kind of showing off the wealth. And Cleveland, like I said, is a great example. So let's talk about where people lived. This is going to be great for our cribs assignment, so pay close attention depending on what your role is. Upper class housing, so if you can, you do live in one of these, right? So we've got Henry Frick's mansion, remember him from the Homestead strike. We've got the Vanderbilt, the Astor. Here in Cleveland, we have Rockefeller's mansion, Carnegie's mansion, and just the opulence is unbelievable. Okay, summer cottages. Yeah, my summer cottage looks like that too, right? So we've got places like the Hamptons in New York City. In Cleveland, you would see these old, huge, beautiful cottages, if you can call them that, in Lakeside and Marblehead. Lakeside and Marblehead were where a lot of the Cleveland industrialists would vacation from the city because it was hot in the summer, right? It's sweltering and it's crowded. And so that's where they would go. So look at just the detail in these houses. Okay, middle class housing. Still good, right? So here we've got some people here in Central Park, which again is something created during the Gilded Age, really, as a green public space. And in Cleveland, we're going to see that the Emerald Necklace, the Metro Parks, are another great example. They just celebrated their 100th anniversary, so a little outside of the Gilded Age, but I would say it's still the same basic thing. Okay, so because, again, land is so expensive, housing is built up and not out. And so a lot of times you'd have 2 or 3 floors, in the brownstone apartments. So a lot of these are New York City, Chicago. If you've ever been to Wrigleyville or any areas in Chicago, this would look very familiar to you. Okay, so they're nice. They're still expensive. I know they are today, but not a lot of space, right? You don't really have a yard. You don't really have an area, and you're living close to where you work because, you don't want to have to go too far out. But once the Model T and once the car starts to come on the scene, then if you can't afford to move out of the city a little bit, you do. And so that's where we'll start to see what we call in Cleveland our inner ring suburbs. Okay, places like Cleveland Heights, Lakewood. You see a lot of housing like this. I actually lived in a house in Lakewood for about 4 years that was built in 1902. Looked very similar to this, and there are often 2-family houses. So you have like an upstairs apartment, and a downstairs. And that's because, there's a real housing boom. There's the need to fill these people who are looking for good quality housing. Now, if you are in the lower or the working class, you're going to be stuck in a tenement, and it's not going to be good. So take a look at this picture. What do you notice about this? Like, the first thing that I see is, what the heck is going on here? Like, who thought that was a good idea, right? So this is the thing, you guys, about a lot of the housing is that, remember, during Gilded Age, there's really no rules, right? There's no safety codes. There's no building codes. So they were just smacking these things up as quickly as they could, wherever they could. So there's not a lot of planning. We're going to have to change that, obviously, as things get more crowded and more dangerous, really. It's going to sort of make people realize, yeah, we need some basic changes. Think about what it would be like to walk down this street and hear all these different languages being spoken and, seeing, this is where New York gets the reputation of the city that never sleeps. It's loud, it's bustling, but this is the reality of the situation in many of the tenements. There's not a lot of reliable running water or heat. There's not a lot of ventilation. Oftentimes you're sharing one bathroom with several families. These are called the dumbbell tenements. And so you can see why it looks like two dumbbells that you could pick up. And, they're not well ventilated. There's not a lot of natural light. That's going to lead itself to spreading of a lot of diseases, things like tuberculosis, which are spread by droplet, by coughing, because you're in such close quarters. So we're going to realize we need to make some changes. But these are the kinds of images that you would see. All right. So here's another thing that concerns me. Why are these children playing on the roof? First of all, why aren't they in school? We're going to talk about that. Second of all, why are they playing on the roof? Well, their parents are probably at work, right? And there's not a lot of access to good public parks and daycare centers. And so, yeah, you'd leave your kids at home. And sometimes they would play games like jump from one rooftop to another. Horrible game. Don't do that. But this is some of the things that we would see happening. So it's going to call for some changes. So you can just see how close together things are. Look, you got the laundry hanging, right? And just not very well ventilated. So really crowded, really congested, and especially when it's hot. Oh my gosh, especially those of you who don't have air conditioning. And especially the higher up you go, the hotter it is. So people would just try to get out and walk around the city and try to get somewhere cool. So in Cleveland, there's an area called Irish Town Bend, and that today is down by the Flats. And that was another working class neighborhood in Cleveland. But just look at this. Just think about, you guys, transport yourself back in time to this street. Pretend you're this little kid walking down there. What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? Right? Think about that. And just how different things are here versus just a few decades before. So we're talking dramatic changes in pretty much every aspect of life during the Gilded Age. All right, let's talk about transportation. So we've got a lot of different ways that people got around. So here is in Chicago, some of the trolleys. Okay, we've got the streetcars, the interurbans. We had these in Cleveland too. A couple pictures of that to show you. If you've ever ridden the L in Chicago, you might not have thought what that stands for. It stands for elevated train. And so there were really two different ways to build. You could build up or you could build down. So Chicago went up. And even today, if you've ever ridden the L downtown, you take some pretty sharp corners, right? On Wabash Avenue and right downtown. And so living near those, it's a little loud. You get used to it, honestly. When I lived in Lakewood, I lived right by railroad tracks 4 houses away. And it's surprising how used to it you get. So yeah, these are just some images. But look, you guys, the old and the new, right? The one way of life passing, new way of life coming in. This guy said, hey, what's up? So subway. This is another way that some cities built. They built under. So Washington, D.C. and New York City are two great examples. And, if you've ever gotten a chance to ride a subway, they're really cool. They're really expensive, though. It's really a kind of a feat of architecture and engineering for the time. We're also going to see cities experiment with bridges. Cleveland is a great example. We've got the West 25th Street Bridge. In New York City, of course, we've got the Brooklyn Bridge. That's going to allow people who, again, if you can afford to move out of the city, you do. Trouble is, guys, not everybody can afford to. So who's left behind? And this is going to be a theme we're going to see really in the 20th century. Who's left behind? The people who can't afford to leave. And so as the people leave the city, so do very often the job opportunities. So do, grocery stores and things like that. And so this is going to be a problem that every city is really going to have to reckon with. So city parks, Cleveland, like I said, with the metro parks, great example that there's a real push to set aside some green space. And of course, Central Park in New York City is probably the most famous one. It's a good thing they really did that because you could see how easy it would be to sell off that land. So now we've got these great park systems that allow people in the city to have a little bit of recreation and some fresh air. daily innovations that make life a little easier. So they are collecting ice. And because remember, before refrigeration, you actually had somebody deliver your ice to you and you'd put it in the ice box, and that would allow you to keep your food a little bit more preserved. People are going to use coal, and then canning becomes more widespread. And so we've got more food available, and we're going to have that's going to increase population a little bit. People are going to get a little more widespread. The beginning of our packaged food industry is really during the Gilded Age. People experiment with breakfast cereals and things like that. So, okay, let's look at what people's houses looked like. Again, be on the lookout of this for your crib show. Different things. So we've got more upper class. You would have your washstands, your pitcher and your bowl, right? This is more middle working class. You don't always have reliable indoor plumbing. So outhouses were still common. And bathtubs, even by comparing people's bathtubs, you can see a big difference in the living style. So Saturday night baths in the galvanized tub, often you wouldn't have enough time or money to really take baths every day. So that's going to add to, the smelliness of the city a little bit. And here's a washboard that people would use to wash their clothes. And so this is why people didn't have that many different clothing, right? Because you have to wash it by hand. Now, look at the bathrooms for some of the upper class. Look at this. Why do you need that in your bathroom, you guys? You don't, right? These tubs are super cool. And if you live in an older house, you may still have one of these. Don't ever get rid of them. They are super heavy and really, really cool. And so they're from this era. They're called the clawfoot tubs. Okay, but just look at the way the upper class lives. So if you have one of the upper class for our cribs assignment, you're going to want to look for examples like this. Look at the opulence, look at the detail, look at all the decoration. Okay, you can even see that in fashion. So look at the hourglass figure that the ladies would have to this was the standard of beauty, right? That they would try to entail. Got to have the bustle, got to have a little junk in the trunk. This, by the way, is manufactured. This is not real. This is made with hoops and wires, and it looks super uncomfortable. It makes me really glad I was born when I was, so I don't have to wear that. Also, another thing I'm not sad to miss, corsets that would really suck your waist in really, really tight. So that was something especially middle to upper class women would always wear. Working class, you don't have time for that, right? You don't have money or time for that. Look at the bathing suits, you guys. Look at the bathing suits. These are bathing suits people would wear that actually weighed people down so much that there were drownings. Because if you've ever tried to swim in your clothes, you know it's not very easy. So can you imagine trying to swim in that? I mean, what? So upper class, what do they wear? Upper class guys, here's what they wear. You got to have the watch. Always got to have the hat. Really distinguishes you as being a member of the upper class. Facial hair is a must during the Gilded Age. And these are the kind of things they would wear. So this is actually Chicago Navy Pier. If you've been to Chicago, it's still there. But you can see even the bathing suits the guys wear are still not revealing at all. People always wore shirts at this point. Here's some, just general etiquette for upper class people during the Gilded Age. And so we've got leisure time activities. What do people do for fun? So photography was definitely a hobby of sort of the elite, and mostly because cameras were still so expensive. Once we got the Eastman Kodak camera, it's going to really drop that price, make it a little bit more attainable for everyone. So playing the piano at home, again, if you have to have spare time to do that, right? So if you're working, you're not going to have the spare time. You're not going to have a piano in your tenement. This is definitely an upper middle class, wealthy activity. So collecting sheet music and listening to it, if you're really lucky, on the Victrola record player. So we have our first kind of, here's our jams of the Gilded Age. And John Philip Sousa, great example. I know a lot of you guys are in band. He's very famous for his marches. In class, we'll click on this and you can hear it, but the Stars and Stripes Forever March is a great example of Sousa's marches. Scott Joplin. Oh, if you play the piano, you know Scott Joplin. He's really a pioneer in the genre of ragtime. So ragtime is very early jazz. And as you can see, Scott Joplin is African American, so this is going to be kind of an African American style of music that's going to grow and become more widespread. And what we will see really throughout U.S. history is African Americans have equality in music long before they have legal equality. Music crosses barriers, you guys. It still does. And I think that's something we see with Scott Joplin. So we'll play the example of the Maple Leaf Rag and the Entertainer in class. Lawn tennis. Again, you need space. So how do you have space? You got to be super wealthy. Anybody play tennis in here? You probably don't wear that, right? You probably don't wear that.